Thank you, Dr. Threja. I have actually questions to both. Dr. Anand, lovely lecture. My only simple query is, how do you decide this IVC or hepatic vein thrombosis is a consequence of HCC, or it preceded and hence the patient had Budd-Chiari before, unless he had symptoms before that? Very often these are initial presentations. Because this would decide. I love your recommendation that you recanalize and then treat these patients. So how do you make this?
Very important question, sir. Actually, I checked everywhere whether how to manage these patients, if the patient has IV secondary Budd-Chiari or primary Budd-Chiari. The only thing which I could find is patients who have HCC in a background of Budd-Chiari syndrome. They usually have advanced cirrhosis features with portal hypertension features. That's the only thing which I could make out from the tables which has been given. It's very difficult to, if the patient has only HCC then and IVC thrombosis, it probably has enhancement which is characteristically seen in HCC.
I'm sorry, now it gets very difficult. A patient with cirrhosis has developed HCC and because of HCC has thrombosed. So very difficult to say now that the cirrhosis was because of
pre-existing
to begin with, and then, so the way we are classifying our patients or incidence in Budd-Chiari, when I look at the papers, so
probably we may have overdiagnosed those patients.
Possible.
Not sure.
Thank you. Can I ask one more question? To Dr. Madhumita, so sorry, fantastic talk actually. Two questions to you. We use a lot of flow track in our ICUs. I don't understand them well. You mentioned that POCUS may be better than the expensive flow tracks. Could you elaborate on that? One. Two, finally, for the house, what is your message? What is the hardware that we should have? Finally, what probes and what machines should you have to make this applicable in your practice? Bare minimum and ideal.
Fantastic questions from my old mentor. First thing is the FlowTrack device. So it's actually the Hemosphere device. The FlowTrack is the the transducer element that we use. That is used. It's based on essentially a kind of fixed principle. What it requires is an arterial line and a central venous catheter, and it tries to look at the flow changes. And there's a mathematical equation that this device uses to see, based on the arterial line variations, it calculates the pulse pressure variation and the stroke volume variation. And based on the central venous catheter, it looks at the difference between the arterial and the venous circulations and gives us a systemic vascular resistance. So the cardiac output and the SVR, as per this equation, has been used on healthy individuals.
That was my point.
So it is not really useful, or it has not been calibrated for liver disease patients. And if we use it in our ICU, especially if they're on high vasopressor, we are already constricting our peripheral circulation. We are giving inotropes, sometimes ADR, phenylephrine, etc. So it's already flogging a dead horse. So these kind of variations that are seen will not be actually reflective on POCUS. And if there's any discrepancy between the point of care ultrasound finding and the flow track, all intensive care societies recommend that the POCUS has to be trusted, because this is a direct visual estimation of flow. As you're an expert in endoscopic ultrasound, you'll realize that on table what you're seeing is going to be more reflective on flow dynamics than anything you would see on a static imaging.
In a cirrhotic, can we rely on flow track to direct our fluid or vasopressor?
In a patient who is undergoing elective surgery, in a patient who is not requiring high vasopressors, it comes within the 2 standard deviation of the normal and may be applicable. But anytime one is adding 2 vasopressors, anytime the patient is severely fluid depleted or is having such severe sepsis that they're vasodilated and the SVRI is coming like 300, 400, it's not reliable. You cannot use it at all. So it's useful up to a point, but beyond that bell curve, it's of no value. Now the question is, what machine do we require? Do you have POCUS? It's much less expensive because it's a one-time investment for the ICU or the ward. We require a transducer probe for echocardiography, which is capable of doing tissue Doppler imaging. So that probe is only going to cost around 5 to 6 lakhs, and bedside devices, the entire device, is going to cost around 20-25 lakhs.
Do you want a transabdominal, or you actually?
No, we should.
Actually, you can see the KEVA with a cardiac probe also. So that's
yes.
what you recommend?
No, the transabdominal probe has got a big fan width and it is useful for getting deeper structures. Whereas what we want is high flow, so high frequency probes are required for the cardiac probe. Sorry, low frequency probes are required for cardiac probes.
Cardiac probe is fine, but
yeah.
will that one probe do, or you want some?
We do. We require 3 probes. So we'll require a cardiac transducer, transducer, a linear transducer for the lung ultrasound, and a transabdominal probe. So this complete set is going to cost just one-time investment, whereas a flow track device each time is expensive, it's invasive. I wouldn't recommend it.
3 probes.
In fact, there's a new probe which has come, Madhumita, which is
Yeah.
called the butterfly probe. It's a portable thing, you can carry it in your pocket.
Yes.
Just 6 months back we saw it. And it's solving all the problems of multiple transducers. It's very easy, especially, but it's designed basically for heart echoes, and it gives a good Doppler too.
Yes.
And we even tried IVC diameter because
Works
most
well.
of us, I don't know, our knowledge is restricted to just looking at the IVC diameter, whether there's any pericardial effusion or the heart is contracting uniformly.
That's good enough.
Because that's a big problem. No, many
That's good enough to most
many
situations.
cirrhotics
sir.
may have restrictive cardiomyopathy,
Yes.
because then you don't know the difference. So always, but at least as a broad thing before you call the cardiologist, I think it's a fantastic thing. But
That's
that
right.
butterfly probe you must try. It's beautiful.
So pocket devices are well available in the US, and I see many people who have worked abroad, and they are largely being used in emergency practice. But unfortunately, due to the PNDT Act, we have to act differently in India. So that's the restriction on user POCUS.
How reliable is your IVC diameter in a patient with cirrhosis? Because your caudate lobe is going to compress your IVC, and on top of that, you're going to have cirrhotic cardiomyopathy. And if you give fluids for somebody with compressed IVC, assuming they are dehydrated, you're going to cause heart failure. So there's a lot of confusion going on IVC diameter in cirrhotic population.
So IVC is not really a well-validated thing in cirrhosis, especially ventilated cirrhotics, those who are undergoing transplantation, or those who have overt heart failure. Obviously, it's not going to reflect what is actually the fluid status, which is why we are recommending using the velocity time integral as a more, optimally and validated tool for looking at fluid dynamics. Most intensive care societies are also recommending it. However, in a patient, suppose the IVC was really small and there was a high collapsibility index, that is the variation with respiration is really high. And on table, while the fluid is going on, you repeat an assessment after an hour. It is now better. That's reasonable. We're not going to give absolute cutoffs like we do for procalcitonin or for any other thing to say that now it is absolutely fine. It depends on the habitus of the patient, how obese they are. An IVC might be 2 centimeter and be euvolemic in a 6'5" gentleman, whereas it will be hypervolemic. So it needs to be looked at in the clinical context. But the delta IVC and the collapsibility matter more.
Okay, that's good.
My question again to Dr. Madhumita. Ma'am, brilliant talk. What is your stand on renal artery resistivity index measurement in cirrhosis with AK and ascites?
Yeah, we have tried looking at renal artery resistivity. It is very difficult to measure it, especially in the bedside. So point of care, it is difficult because our devices, through all the ascites, there is always a drop in Doppler flow. So we have not only looked at that, we have looked at hepatic artery and hepatic venous as per the RECOVER protocol, but it doesn't really work. So I will not recommend it to be used as per bedside devices because of the low sensitivity of our transducers. It can be done in main departments and it will be useful.
Ma'am, in our practice, I agree totally with what you've said because I'm also finding it very difficult.
Difficult to measure. I agree. That's why I don't report the findings because they vary so much that I don't rely upon them.
Actually, we have looked at the RRI, found that the delta RRI is very good in prognosticating whether the patient will respond to terlipressin
Yes, sir.
and also mortality. That is one thing. And the second thing is regarding IVC measurements. You take it at the point where the IVC enters the right atrium because most of the literature
0.3
says,
centimeters away from the right atrium.
okay,
0.3 centimeters.
literature says that it's about 2 centimeters from where the IVC enters the right atrium or 1 centimeter below where the hepatic vein enters the...
I apologize. It's 1 centimeter. I'm sorry, 0.3 is where ONSD is, sorry. It is 1 centimeter, but it needs to be looked at the middle hepatic vein. Suppose the entry is very close to the right atrium, then measuring it over there will not be reflective. So one needs to look at the correct point and it should be measured 90 degrees palatal. Most of the time it won't make much of a difference because there will be 0.2, 0.3 variation between these two sides. But wherever we decide to measure it in the patient, that should be fixed. So that doesn't matter much.
And there are some papers that say that this 1 centimeter or 2 centimeter difference does not matter. You can measure it anywhere
Delta.
along the IVC but above
Yes.
the renal veins.
Agreed, sir.
I think POCUS has been the focus of all questions. I'll ask you one question, sir, in your thing. We all use galactomannan in openly for aspergillosis because we are probably empirically covering for Candida. Whereas your one thing which was there, that 1,3-beta-D-glucan,
Yeah.
which had a very nice negative predictive values, is it readily available? Are we actually using it, or is it only theoretical?
I'm not a microbiologist. I am not very sure about the availability. It's not readily available anyway. And it has got a very good negative predictive value, which means that once you have started treatment, and maybe after 3 to 4 days of anti-candidal measures or treatment for aspergillosis, if the 1,3-beta-D-glucan is very low, that means you can step down the therapy or even take the patient off the treatment. I'm not very sure. It's not easily available. Even galactomannan, if you do it in the galactomannan, if you do it in the blood, it is not very sensitive in liver patients. But if you do a BAL and then do the galactomannan, then it is supposed to be much more sensitive and specific.
I think it is easily available, beta-D-glucan. I mean, most of the corporates probably have it. Yeah.
So my question was regarding how do you approach when a blood culture reports Candida auris? I had 3-4 patients. One was on an improving trend. When we consulted the ID team or microbiology, they ignore it, telling that it might be a commensal. But literature says that it scares us with the name of Candida auris. So any takes on that?
Yeah. If you have Candida auris infection, it is always better to go for echinocandins because most of them may not be sensitive to fluconazole. For Candida albicans, this problem is not because resistance to triazoles is very, very low.
So my question is for Dr. Devdas only. Regarding beta-D-glucan and galactomannan. Now beta-D-glucan is supposedly released by the fungal cell wall itself. So it should reflect directly the presence of a fungal antigen in the fungal cell wall, at least in the body. My question is, does it actually even colonizers, will they also have an elevated beta-D-glucan? Have studies really looked at that? Whereas invasive fungal infection, because all of us will have colonization, all of us in hospitals certainly, we would have some invasion, colonization with some bacterial or fungal cell organism. And the second question is galactomannan.
Yeah.
So again, that is reactive. So that is not, and it is also having a problem with use of this tazobactam, piperacillin tazobactam and other antibiotics which also elevated levels, which is routinely used in all of these patients. So what is your take on the literature about these?
Basically, the diagnosis with galactomannan may not be accurate in patients with liver disease. But if you do a BAL and you find the galactomannan in that secretion, then it's supposed to be much more sensitive and specific. Regarding beta-D-glucans, then the negative predictive value is very high. But you don't actually use it to diagnose the infection, but you are treating the patient and you do a 1,3-beta-D-glucan, and if you find it's very low, you can step down the treatment or even take it out of the treatment.
Start treatment on basis of a high beta-D-glucan.
I don't think so. At least literature does not quote much on the sensitivity and specificity of this in starting treatment.
Yeah. So I think the session has generated the most discussion and we are running short of time. So I think we should close the session.
And must congratulate all the three speakers for excellent talk. And despite the less crowd in Hall 2, I think the questions by the audience were fantastic. Lovely discussion.
And I think that indicates the growing interest of hepatologists in critical care hepatology also. And I suggest you to have a hands-on workship for people like me who needs to be educated in the INASL 2025.